Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tales of the LGBTQ. My name is Douglas Parsons. Today, we're going to talk to our historian, our storyteller. His name is Ron Byers, and he's here today to talk about a very personable story, a story that relates to him, but it also affects so many others. Ron, how's it going today?
Not too bad, Douglas. It's good to be here and nice to be talking about a subject that has been part of my life for a good part of it.
Yeah, when we were talking about having you on this podcast, you have always been in this slot, fourth person up, our cleanup hitter, talking about gay history. We've changed our ideas as to what we are going to talk about, and then it was soon after Robert Hamilton's episode where he talked about growing up in the 80s, at the coming out in the time of HIV and AIDS, where we had a discussion and we changed our focus. Why is this topic of HIV and AIDS so important to you?
Well, growing up, I came out in 1969, so I've been part of the gay community here in Edmonton for a good many years. And then in the 80s, along came this virus that nobody knew anything about, didn't know what it did, but we did know that people died. And those early years were tough. We would. I had so many friends that fell victim to it. Nobody knew how it was transmitted. In the beginning, they didn't know it. Could you touch somebody or could you kiss somebody and catch it? I mean, these are all things that we had to deal with in those early years, and it was tough. It had a huge impact on people, and people responded to it in so many different ways. Some people said, well, what can I do? I don't know how, I don't know how it's transmitted. So, I just roll the dice and played the odds. Other people looked at it and said, yeah, I don't want to have any part of this, and withdrew from the gay scene or withdrew from sexual activities altogether. Um, and then there was others that just said, okay, well, we'll deal with it as it comes. As more information came out, and things like the use of condoms were promoted as a preventative measure, that kind of loosened things up. But it still impacted people in many different ways. And with so many of our friends dying, so many of us were going through PTSD, and it's still, for many people, it haunts them to this day. Recently, there was a small television series that came out of Britain called It's a Sin. And, a lot of people have watched it, but there's a lot of us who've been around for a long time that have been hesitant to watch it, or for me, I have not watched it as yet, and it may take some time before I actually do so, because the memories that it will bring back of the people that I lost are going to be pretty hard. But it also impacted me in a odd way. I didn't want to deal with the death of my friends. Instead, I chose to see it as someone who was a part of my life, and then they are no longer a part of my life. So I have the memories of them when they were a part of my life. I don't have that memory of having to go to a funeral. I have not been to a funeral or a memorial service for anyone who has passed away from HIV or AIDS in many, many, many years. In fact, the only funerals I've gone to have been from immediate and close family, because I just don't want to deal with it. That's how I dealt with it. That was the reaction. That was personal for me, is not going to funerals. So for other people, it manifested in different ways, and that's just something that our generation had to deal with. It was tough.
So, with your experience of being an announcer, being a spearheader of events, you were watching the people around you, the people that you loved, contracting this disease, dying of this disease. Did you experience the emotions involved with perhaps feeling guilty about not having it at this time, or perhaps even wondering why it had not affected you as of yet?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there was always a am I next moment. Almost every single night that I was out and choosing to pick somebody up. You talked about some of my announcing activities and stuff like that. In the 80s, I actually became quite active, not only within the gay community, which I've been fairly active in, but also within the general Edmonton community, starting with getting on the Klondike Days Association's organizing committees. I was in charge of all the marching bands and getting them into the city and whatnot, and then through a number of things, was on the board of that. I was involved with Northlands through the Klondike Days Parade, through their Youth Talent Quest, doing talent shows for youth in the city here. I was with the Heritage Days Festival. And then when I was diagnosed, I had to give so much of that up because at that point my health had failed so miserably. And when I received the diagnosis, I had been, for the previous year, I had been getting numerous bouts of pneumonia, and it kept coming back in the fall or in the winter of '97. I went into the hospital because I thought I was having a minor stroke or heart attack, and they diagnosed me with shingles at the time and asked if I had ever been tested for HIV. So for 6 months prior to that, I've been, pneumonia and then the shingles. In all that time period, not one doctor thought to do an HIV test, not one. And it wasn't
Hmm.
until April of 1998 that one day I was getting ready for work and I was sitting here in my kitchen having something. I'd made something to eat and I literally didn't have the energy to lift the fork up to my mouth. And I thought, yeah, it's time to go to the hospital. So I drove myself to the U of A hospital and went in and saw the emergency, and they had me in a bed fairly quickly, and I was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS at the time. I had pneumocystis pneumonia, I had shingles, um, and a number of other things at the time. And I still have the letter of referral from the doctor from the hospital. At the time, my viral load was 490,000 copies, almost 500,000 copies per milliliter. Um, these days, they suggest starting treatment when it's all around 1,000 sort of thing. So I was like right off the top there, um, and being diagnosed with full blown AIDS. Now, why I made it out of hospital, I don't know. I mean, pneumocystis pneumonia was the number one killer of people back in the day. Um, maybe I was lucky. Maybe it was I got there just in time that the antibiotics worked. I was in hospital for 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks, and then when I got home, I was on oxygen for another month after that. Um, and
Wow.
it took a while for me to sort of build back strength so I could go back to work. Um, and I still don't know why, but when they came in and the doctor that first day said you are HIV positive. She said, "Would you like to talk to somebody? We've got somebody outside here for you." And I said, "No, no, I'm good." My thought process at that time was, "Okay, it's my turn. Um, everybody else has had it, so why not me?" So I was good with it at the time. I guess in my mind I'd already formulated that so much had been going on with my health that that I just thought, well, this is what's going to happen. So it was an interesting thought process at the time, even for me. I thought it was kind of odd, but it was easy to accept it.
Well, let's go back and maybe for the people who don't know, maybe asking this to themselves. What is the difference between HIV and AIDS?
AIDS is the advanced stage. So these days they don't call it full-blown AIDS. These days they label HIV in stages. HIV one, stage two, stage three, and what was referred to as full-blown AIDS is stage four, and that's where your body has been subjected to numerous opportunistic infections, and it's so susceptible at that point to other opportunistic infections coming along. So when you've got a multitude of opportunistic infections like, pneumocystis pneumonia and shingles and, a number of other things that can impact on the body's health, that's where you're at full-blown AIDS or stage 4 HIV.
When we were talking about this story itself, I was struck by the fact that you were diagnosed in 1998. And considering that the HIV/AIDS crisis began in the early 80s when we began to know more about it, you had a long stretch without receiving this type of diagnosis. Um, so you so I can see in your mind that by receiving this diagnosis, you were like, ah, it was inevitable, it was going to happen. 1996 was the year when the cocktail came out, where things started to change when it came to people living with HIV. Can you tell me more about what were the medical strategies and procedures that were done before 1996, before the cocktail came out?
In the early years, they used primarily single-use drugs. So AZT was one of the first ones that they developed, and they brought it out initially in a fluid form only. So it had to be done intravenously, and at the time, it was known to be very, very toxic. Um, oh, as it sort of helped, but they knew that one drug wasn't going to combat the disease. All it did really was is extended the life for a lot of the people that were on it. But the toxic effects of it were also really hard to deal with as well. They gradually were able to reformulate AZT into a pill or a compound that could be taken, and that made it easier. But it still, I mean, they had to use it in such high doses, and there's numerous pills in a day that they had to take. Um, so it was tough, and then they came out with other ones like DDL, which is did a no. Okay, I'm not even going to try DDL,
Yeah.
DDC, and D4T, as well as 3TC. 3TC was one that kind of stuck around for a while. The other ones were really hard on the body. Um, in the late 90s, they or in the mid 90s, they finally come up with um, these other drugs. They realized that if they combat it from different viewpoints on the virus, that it helps in beating it down. So they developed another group of those drugs were what was called nucleoside inhibitors, I think, um, and no, sorry, nucleoside analogs, or just plain nukes. So they come up with another category of drugs that attacks it differently, called protease inhibitors. And today, even still, they use a combination of a protease inhibitor with something else as well. Even a lot of the PrEP drugs that you see on the market are quite often two different drugs in there as well. So with the advent of that, they come up with regimens that use a multiple different drugs, and that helped. It helped bring it down. AZT continued to be used, and they combined it with the 3TC, which was one of the early drugs, into a pill called Combivir. And Combivir was very, very popular, and it still is used today, particularly in the third world countries, because it's so cheap. But what was known about AZT and the 3TZ, is particularly AZT, is that it is toxic. Now, at the time, they didn't know what those effects were. And it wasn't until the late 90s that they realized that, that it was toxic to the mitochondrial chain, um, and can cause problems in that respect. So they started coming out with more newer drugs and ones that were less toxic. And so, a lot of the drugs that you see today are far from being toxic. I was originally on AZT and DDC in the early years, as well as one called Indinavir. That was my cocktail at the time when I was first diagnosed in 1998, and I wasn't great with it. I missed taking some pills. There was some of them were awful to take, so my doctor would change it up and put me on to a different one because as I was missing medications, my body built up a resistance to the HIV drug. And that's what's so important about HIV medications is that if you fail to take them, your body actually builds up a resistance to that drug. That's why it's so critical that people take their HIV meds regularly, and why they strive to come up with ones that are like one pill a day, because most people can handle one pill a day. But in those early years, there was you were taking pills every couple hours, every 4 hours, multiple pills, and it just got. I mean, it literally got to the point for me where I thought, why the heck am I even taking all these pills when, I still only have a 50-50 chance of living? And I thought, yeah, it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it. I'd become, at that point, this is 2000, had become so resistant to the majority of the medications that just kind of felt futile. So I went off the medications completely, and I thought, you know what? Let's just let the disease take its toll and leave it like that. I mean, I never had expectations at that point that I was going to live to be an old man, or live to even be my age that I am now and be sitting here talking to you. Zero expectations of that, none whatsoever. So it was a tough time.
So besides the mental toll and the pills, how else did your life change when you received the diagnosis?
Because of the pneumocystis pneumonia, it damaged my lungs along with, at that point, 25 years of smoking, I guess, a little over 25 years of smoking. So my lungs are heavily damaged. Now, I was doing a lot of announcing work for various things, and I remember after I had gone back to work, I was supposed to MC a youth talent show for Northlands out at West Edmonton Mall in the food court fountain area there in Phase 3, and I started announcing, and I barely got through one show, and realized I can't do this. It's just taking way more energy than I have. I can't stand here and talk for for something like this. And so the next day, I called up my friend Pat Riley, who at the time was managing the Roost, I believe, at that time, and he had done some announcing work. So I said, Pat, can you come over and do today's MC work for this? And that was it. I realized at that moment that my time in community service was at an end. I was kind of done with it. Now, I had sort of already had plans for the year 2000 as part of the Imperial Southern Corps of the Wild Rose. A good friend of mine, Daryl, also known as Mr. Vera, him and I had decided to run for Emperor and Empress 25 for the 25th year of the Imperial Southern Corps of the Wild Rose. And our Vera's slogan was Vera 2000, because that was the year that we were campaigning. We kind of started campaigning a couple of years before, which we weren't supposed to do, but it made it easier because nobody else ran against us, so it was a shoe-in. But I went into that. I went into the campaign, and I was not on HIV meds at all, and really didn't know if I was going to make it to my stepping down at that point in time. And it wasn't until I met a fellow who had come out from Vancouver, was looking for a place to stay while he tried to get his life in order. And so I offered him, a place in my apartment. Um, and he, over the course of the, a month or two that he was there, he was here, that he managed to talk me into, realizing that maybe I needed to enjoy life a little bit longer. So I decided to go back on the meds. So I went back to my doctor, who was very understanding, Dr. Barbara Romanowski, who was a pioneer in HIV patient care here in Alberta. She was the first that actually developed a practice based solely on HIV patients. And she put me onto a medication regime that I stayed on from 2000, I guess, until 2015. I was on the same one, and that was also including the Combivir, so the AZT. So that helped. It took a few years for me to bring my viral load back down to where I was undetectable, and as I did that, my health started returning. And I was able to get back to work and do jobs and stuff like that. But I was on Combivir, which contained AZT, and AZT is known to be toxic and cause mitochondrial toxicity. And that opened up a whole new other ballgame of health issues.
When you talk about the toxicity, what what does that manifest to be? What does that look like?
So even in the late 90s, they knew that AZT caused mitochondrial toxicity. There's actually a term for it. It's called drug-induced mitochondrial toxicity. But they didn't have the technology to fix. I mean, they knew what mitochondria were, sort of, but they didn't really know what they did and how they function and stuff like that. The technology just didn't exist to figure out what mitochondria actually did. That's only happened in the last 10, 12 years. That they've been able to explore all this. They just knew it did it. They didn't know the impacts of it. So mitochondrial mitochondrial dysfunction can happen primarily in kids, and it's usually because of um, genetic disorders that happen that cause the mitochondria to become deformed. Um, it um, Basically, now that the mitochondrial toxicity causes something very similar, where the mitochondria are actually disfigured in a way. So it's mtDNA and mitochondrial DNA are actually disfigured, and that disrupts the whole metabolism process because they're an integral part of it. They actually are the catalyst that converts what you take in the form of food and beverage fluids and converts that into energy or fat. So either into energy that you need right now or stored as fat in the body. And that process is disrupted. So it's complicated, and there are no specialists for this drug-induced mitochondrial toxicity in all of Alberta. Um, and what was happening with me is that as my body was becoming more and more run down through this process, I was losing weight. Um, I was losing energy. I was losing strength. In 2010, I realized that I'd gotten to a point that I could no longer work. I just didn't have the physical energy left to work. Plus, it was causing other problems with my body. And then so I ended up having to stop working, and I went on AISH, which is Alberta Insured Income for the Severely Handicapped. And I was on that until I turned 65. Um, and My health continued to decline for quite a few years after that.
When going through this journey, when you're realizing that your body's shutting down and your body's changing and it's difficult, were your doctors always knowing exactly why you were experiencing certain symptoms?
an excellent question. And the answer is no, not in the least. They had no concept of it. They had no knowledge. It's not taught in doctor school. They didn't know what to do with it. And it was frustrating. I mean, in 2010 or 2011, I started experiencing symptoms like my head feels like it's got this immense pressure in it, which when I overheat, my body overheats, or when the sun is really hot on my head, it gets worse. It feels like it wants to explode all the time. I've got a constant ringing in my ear. Um, I couldn't develop any saliva. I couldn't develop tears. I didn't sweat. I had no energy. Just walking up, a story and a half to my apartment with 2 grocery bags, I'd have to sit down and rest for 10 minutes. I couldn't process fats. So, like chicken skin and the fat on that, if I had that, that would go right through my body. One of the biggest problems in both HIV and mitochondrial toxicity is that the ability to process fats is greatly reduced. The body just doesn't know what to do with them, so it kind of separates them out and flushes them out of the system as quickly as possible. And it does that in a not very nice way. And it does it without warning, and it became a bad situation for me. And for a while there, I was, I couldn't go anywhere. I was afraid of going out because I didn't know if my body was going to react. For a while there, I had to wear diapers if I did have to go out. It was not pleasant. And my HIV specialist at the time was a resident. My Dr. Romanowski had decided to go closer to retirement, and so she had reduced her practice. And so I was at the K Edmonton clinic, and the residents that I've seen, and it was getting so frustrating. In 2016, I was down to 48 kilograms, and I apologize. My weight, since I was diagnosed, has been measured in kilograms, so I can only talk in kilograms now. I was down to 48 kilograms, and I know that's close to 100 pounds. So, and yet I was eating, and it was still going through me, but I was eating, and it just wasn't doing anything for me. And I had gotten to the point where I was ready to give up. I was ready to stop taking my meds again and just die. I was done with life. I was done with being cooped up all the time. I was done with having no energy. I was done with just being, in a place where there was just no quality of life. And I was at an appointment with my HIV doctor, and she had a dietitian come in and talk with me, and it was something that she said about metabolizing fats and stuff like that got me on this. Okay, that maybe there's something here that I need to look at. So I started doing my own research, and the more I researched, the more I started coming up with answers. And one of the things that I came up with was, first of all, what I was going through was what was called HIV wasting, or cachexia. And that was a common phenomenon with HIV people who had HIV. They would lose their weight, their cheeks would get hollow, they would become skeletons, basically. That was not uncommon at all. HIV wasting, in the late 90s, Serono, who make a product called Sazin, or human growth hormone, come out with one called Serostim that they tested on people with HIV wasting. And what they found was that it significantly improved their ability to put back on weight and muscle. And so they got approved by the FDA in the US, and they got approved by Health Canada here. The problem with the Serostim, they weren't very ethical about how they brought it out. First of all, they marketed it in ways that were unacceptable and actually got fined by the FDA down in the US. They have a sister product called Sazin, which they can give out in different doses. But the Serostim, they removed the bacteriostat from the solution. So the 10 milligram vial that it came in, and that was the recommended dosage, 10 milligrams. Once you opened it, you had to use it. It was dead. It was done within 24 hours. So if you didn't want 10 milligrams, then you had to throw that 10 milligram vial, which was worth $6,000, into the garbage. So it wasn't widely used because of the cost, and particularly here in Canada, the cost of it was exorbitant. I mean, in a month, you'd be looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars for it. But there it was on the list of recommended treatment for HIV cachexia. So I talked to them about it, and they said, no, absolutely not. There's other stuff I can do. And I said, like what? You've done other stuff, nothing's working. So I went to my family doctor, and he has been so supportive of me, Dr. Al Jahash at the Hy's Medical Center clinic. He had seen me a few times beforehand. He knew I was HIV positive. He had just finished his residency here in Alberta. He had his medical training done in Iran, and he was so amazing. He said, okay. I said, I'd like this prescribed for me. And he says, all right. So we did. I looked up the recommended dosage, and the recommended dosage for somebody my size was 0.4 milligrams. 0.4, not 10 milligrams, 0.4. Now that's based on somebody with low growth hormone in their body. So I went on that, and within 3 weeks, I mean, the difference was amazing. So I continued on it, and I upped the dosage to 0.5 to complete it comes in a box of 5 pens, and that lasted me 16 weeks or something like that. And it wasn't that expensive. It was like $800. And by the end of me doing this, I was stunned by how much of an improvement it had made on me. I mean, I was starting to hold my food in better. I had more energy, and I don't know if I maybe had put on a kilogram or 2 at the time, but it definitely made a huge improvement. Now, the only way to get that approved on AISH was that it had to be approved by an endocrinologist. So I went and saw an endocrinologist, and I spent half an hour talking to the resident that did patient history, and then he went out of the room and brought in the endocrinologist, and she spent 5 minutes with me. 5 minutes, and said no. So the endocrinologist came out and said no to me, but she also said, we can't do any of the tests that we would normally need to do because you're already on it. And she said you'd have to wait like 6 months. And so I thought, okay, fine. So I finished the prescription that I had. I waited 6 months, went off of it. My health started declining again. I started losing weight. I started having problems eating. And then I went back to my family doctor and asked for a second referral to a new endocrinologist for a second opinion. And 2 weeks later, he called and said, no, we can't get a second opinion. And I said, well, who said no? And he said, the guy that decides who gets a second opinion. And I found out that was the director of endocrinology at the University of Alberta Hospital, Dr. Peter Sr. And so I thought, yeah, okay. At this point, I was kind of upset. I got a copy of the original endocrinologist patient report, and there was inaccuracies in it. There were things that I did not say. She made assumptions, and so I was quite upset. So I blasted off this email to the Dr. Senior at the U of A, and was quite critical and insisted on a second appointment. That same weekend, I happened to be seeing my family doctor, and he happened to have an endocrinologist who had just come out from Toronto doing some clinic time in his clinic. So he did a referral to me to this guy, and so I went and saw him the following week, literally. And he said, I'm not sure how we tackle this. I mean, this is stuff I don't know anything about. And I said, but I'd like your support on this. And he says, well, I don't know. I'd have to talk to my to the guy that I'm doing rounds at the university hospital. And I said, oh, who is that? And he says, oh, Dr. Senior. I said, well, I think if you talk to Dr. Senior, he will know who I am. And so he ended up doing that. He did consult with him. He ended up prescribing the local human growth hormone, and it was I picked a brand that was easy to administer. It comes in a pen like diabetics use, an insulin injection type pen. So I was able to get on that, and again, my health started improving dramatically. And this doctor that I was seeing would regularly consult with Dr. Peter, which was great. And he would also consult with, like, when they were doing rounds in the hospital, he would also talk about what was going on with me with the other residents that were doing rounds with him as well. So one day I was at my family doctor's, and he again had another endocrinologist in there doing clinic time. He says, oh, I want you to talk to this doctor. She's an endocrinologist. So I went in and I talked to her, and she says, I know who you are. Your doctor's been talking about you. I said, great, that's great. So unfortunately, he left, and he transferred my care to another doctor in the clinic that he was at. And I went and saw her, and it was just immediately a bad choice. She just was not interested in looking outside of her box. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that doctors are they get stuck in their boxes, and they can't see outside of it. And they aren't willing to look at any information beyond what they see in their doctor books at doctor school. That's all they can see. And so it was frustrating. And so I ended up going back to Dr. Peter and writing another email and complaining. And he ended up taking me on as his own patient. And he's now my endocrinologist of choice, and he's been fairly supportive. We still butt heads every once in a while on dosages and stuff like that. But he has been supportive about the process. But there is literally no experts in this area of medicine, none. And that's been the whole thing that I've been plagued with, is the arrogance of doctors not willing to go outside of their box. They get stuck in this rut, and they are unwilling to see outside of it. I had my HIV care transferred to another doctor who is very well known, has been around for many years, has done work in Africa and around the world on HIV. And my first meeting with him, I went in and I talked about being on the human growth hormone, and he said, nope, that is a red line I will not cross. Will not cross. And I said, but it's there in the information. He says, that's okay. I'm not going to cross it. I don't believe in it. I don't think it's good for you. I'm not going to go there. He said, you've got an endocrinologist. That's fine. Let them prescribe it. I don't want anything to do with it. And then the other thing he said was, maybe you should try eating more. And that just blew my brain off the top, because I ate. I mean, I literally, since I quit smoking in 2005, I do what most people do, which is start stuffing candy and everything else in your mouth, right? So I did. And I've been doing that. I still do that to this day. After dinner, I literally sit down and go through my junk food cupboard from one end to the other. That pissed me off so much that I downloaded MyFitnessPal, one of the tracking apps for people who are losing weight, and I weighed absolutely everything I ate for 3 months, and then brought the results in to the dietitian and to him, and I showed him that I was eating 2,500 calories a day and losing weight at 2,500 calories.
Yeah, I think it's important just to remind everyone that this challenge with the doctors, 2016, this is recent. This is happening now. This isn't 20, 30 years ago when it comes to doctors' response to HIV and AIDS. It's happening now. You mentioned that there wasn't a specialist, and I'm going to swear here, but why the fuck do we not have a specialist, a doctor specialist in this HIV/AIDS treatment here within the province?
Um, it's this specific area, and it's only now being researched. I mean, a lot of the information that I've come up with is all stuff that has been researched in the last 8 to 10 years or less. Um, and how doctors are. You bring in something from the internet and they go, oh no 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 no, we don't do that. And yet, but if they did a study and it was published, do you think they would want other people to read their stuff? Of course they do, and accept their stuff. Yeah, no, they're very two-faced about that. So I've had to literally force information up on people, and I did come across um, uh, the information about the AZT and the Camembert being causing mitochondrial toxicity. So I had to research mitochondrial toxicity, what causes that. There are two websites that do talk about it, and one of them has or they both have what's called a mito cocktail. And so I looked at the mito cocktail and I thought, okay, maybe this is worth trying. Now, I'd also seen a gastroenterologist for the problems with the bad diarrhea and all the rest of it, and they had put me on enzyme supplements, though they didn't really see any major system problems. They just were basing it on what they knew inside their box. So I was on these enzyme supplements, and they helped a minor bit, but it still didn't help a lot. One of the things on the mitochondrial toxicity or mito cocktail. So I've got a lot of stuff around me because I knew I had to get in the weeds on some of this stuff. Give me a second. Where is the mito cocktail? Oh, we go. The things that are in the mito cocktail include coenzyme or CoQ10. Okay, that's really good antioxidant, and it's something I take now on a regular basis. Alpha lipoic acid, and that had been mentioned to me on a visit to another specialist at some point in that 10-year history. Alpha lipoic acid was actually tested on HIV patients who were taking fairly toxic medications, and it applies across the board to a lot of things, including cancer drugs. Alpha lipoic acid is an antioxidant, and it helps push toxic meds through your system. So and it could be used by anybody. You can't overdose on it. It's not toxic to the body. It just helps get toxins out of your body. It helps process them through your body faster. And also L-carnitine. Now, the more I researched about L-carnitine, the more I found out that, first of all, it has been recommended in HIV treatment because the HIV virus tends to deplete the L-carnitine, which is essential in the body processing fats and in processing muscles. So I thought, well, okay, I should probably be on this. And then I also found out that gastroenterologists also recommend using L-carnitine for, again, the same reasons, processing fats and stuff like that. So I got onto the L-carnitine, and that was the next step in improvement, and that made another significant difference in improving myself. The other thing that's recommended is creatine, which also helps build up muscles and stuff like that in the body. So those two products, L-carnitine and creatine, are both available at Popeyes or any of your health stores that specialize in bodybuilding products. So, I never thought in my life that I would ever go into a shop that specializes in bodybuilding, but here I am every couple months now going in to buy L-carnitine. I don't do the creatine that much, so I rarely use it, but I definitely do the L-carnitine, and I can tell you it made a huge, huge difference in my health. That was kind of the next plateau. I also found out that what happens is that the mitochondrial toxicity causes all these, an excess of reactive oxygen species, or ROS, or free radicals. And that's the process, that's part of the process of converting all your fats and whatnot into stored energy or into energy. And if there's an excess of it, then it really hampers the system. It can be toxic as well. So the L-carnitine helps with that. Testosterone also helps bring that down. So my own body's testosterone was battling these reactive oxygen species and wasn't going to the rest of the places that it needed to be. So testosterone supplements helped to battle that all down again. So this, and again, there's no doctor to tell you this. Literally, I mean, this is all stuff that I've had to research on my own. I've had to figure it out on my own. So my medication these days is, I take a 0.5 milligrams of human growth hormone, 200 milligrams of CoQ10, 1,500 milligrams of L-carnitine with every meal, so 3,000 a day roughly. And I also take a multivitamin, a vitamin D, an extra vitamin D, because I was diagnosed with osteoporosis, which is also a result of the mitochondrial toxicity and also HIV. And I've added back in the enzyme supplements that were originally prescribed, which I had stopped taking because I really found them ineffective. And I found that that's helped a lot. So I've gone from 48 kilograms in 2016 to this morning, I was at 65.4 kilograms, which is a pretty significant gain. And on top of that, I have energy. I mean, last spring when the coronavirus pandemic hit, I was out walking almost every day and was doing miles, literally. And that's something that I had not. I mean, I walked more last spring than I did in the entire decade beforehand. And I'm back, being involved in the community again. I'm back being involved with a number of groups. I've done work with the Edmonton Men's Health Collective on their peer-and-peer project. I've done some, history stories on the history of gay bars in Edmonton and the history of the Imperial Southern Court of Wild Rose for the Edmonton City as Museum project. I've been serving on the jury for grants through the Edmonton Heritage Council. So I worked on the seniors program at the Edmonton Pride Center, developing a program for that. So this has all come because I pushed doctors to get out of their box and listen and prescribe what I wanted for my health. And that push, that perseverance to get them to listen was a challenge. It's not for the faint of heart. But it got me to where I am today.
Yeah. Well, and one of the questions I was going to go back and ask you was, what does it mean to have a doctor listen, and what does it mean for them to be on your side? And you mentioned here the listening is important, those type of things. But I also have to do a little bit of devil's advocate here too. When it comes to all of this medication that you're saying, it's the initial stages. There's not a lot known, perhaps. Would wouldn't it be true that a doctor wouldn't want to use you as a petri dish to discover and to find out these things? I think it would be smart, perhaps, by a doctor to hedge a little bit, to be a little bit patient. Am I right with that? Or are you like, nope, dose me up. I want to be a petri dish on about this.
My position is that go ahead. Let me be the petri dish. I'm good with that. I see this as, okay, nobody else knows what to do with it. I've been asking for this to be done, and it's working. It has worked fabulously. There's no question about it. There's nothing wrong with me. Well, I can't say there's nothing wrong with me. I'm certainly way ahead of what I was, 5 years ago. And at 5 years ago, I was ready to die. I was almost dead. I mean, I doubt if I would have made the year at that point in time. My body had just run down so far that I doubt it. So I've already gained, 4 or 5 years. And, if I push them and push the dosages a bit so that my health improves even more, even if I only get a year or two of great health, that's a year or two I simply never would have had. And if I die after that, I'm happy. you know, getting doctors to understand that process is difficult. And my family doctor has been fairly good. Dr. Senior has been good, but cautious. I mean, he's the head of endocrinology, so he has to worry about himself, has to worry about his position, and he's only got his own experiences to go on. Um, and over this last year, it's been difficult because we've had to do our appointments by telephone, and so that's put a kink in things as well. But doctors really need to step back a little bit and think outside the box once in a while. Not everything fits into the box, and I'm definitely not in the box.
Earlier in this interview, you talked about not taking HIV medication, these peaks and valleys that have been going on with you throughout this thing. 2016, it hits the breaking point where you thought you were going to die. And but you also, when you were talking here, it sounded to me at times that you were ready. You were ready for it. So what the heck happened within you to kind of say, no, I'm going to fight, and now's the time? Because beforehand, I I hear from you that that fight wasn't there as much. So what happened with you to all of a sudden say, this is bullshit and we've got to do something about this?
That's part of my personality. Um, if you give me something and I look at it and say, okay, yes, this is so, and then you present it to people and they say, yeah, whatever, whatever. But I just spend a lot of time looking at this, whatever, whatever. Well, that gets me pissed off. I mean, it gets me really pissed off. I mean, if you're not going to give me the time of day to at least consider what I've spent a lot of time putting together, then what's this all about? So it was anger. It was anger the doctors weren't listening to me. It was anger that there was hope for me, and they weren't willing to consider it. It was anger that nobody knew anything about this, and yet there was some information, limited, but some information on what might work. And so yeah, it was anger that drove me initially. And after that, it was the success of pushing people with that anger that now, here I am. I'm fairly healthy. I mean, I'm far from perfect. I still could die any day. There's still other things going on with me that the doctors have just, they have no idea. And at this point, I'm just living with them. Um, you know, but it's yeah, the reversal is because now I see there's hope. You know, I mean, I've lived, the last 25 years one day at a time, literally. I mean, every day I could die. That has been my premise. I had no future in mind ever. I never even thought I would be on, old age security or Canada pension. I mean, I never thought I would reach that age ever ever. I mean, and yet here I am. I'm having to deal with it. I'm having to deal with the fact that I had no money saved because why save money? You're going to be dead. I mean, what was the purpose? So yeah, that's one of the interesting aspects of it is that I had reached a point, back I was at when I was diagnosed that okay, you're going to be dead soon. Why plan for the future when there is zero chance of future? And now, I sit here today talking with you, and I see, at least that there may be a future. There maybe I'm going to have a few more years. And that's been a readjustment for me too, because up until the last year or two, I never thought I would have a future. I never thought I'd live, another year or another 2 years. At this point, maybe I'll live another 5. Who knows?
One thing with listening to you today, and I think it's important to point out, is you hear a lot of people self-diagnosing, or you hear people researching themselves on the internet, and they find this fat or this essential oil or something like that. However, I would want to point out that what you were finding was medication. You were finding real life studies. We weren't looking for voodoo type medicine here. You were simply speaking out on your own behalf, trying to find medication that is within the system that can be prescribed, and you're wanting your doctors to give that to you. And I think that's an important thing to point out here as well, because we when we get sick, we go to WebMD and we find out that a cough is actually cancer, and we get worried or something like that. But you yourself, you are advocating for yourself using trusted medication, or what should be trusted medication.
And one of the things about that point is that because there has not been a lot of research on this, new research is coming out all the time. And as a perfect example of that, a couple of weeks ago, I came across a study that was done at the University of Barcelona, which took 2 HIV recommended PEP treatments, so post-exposure prophylaxis, which is given to people when they think they've been exposed with HIV, but so far haven't shown that they have it. So they give post-exposure prophylaxis after the fact. And they compared 2 treatments, and one of them was a protease inhibitor along with Combivir. And the other one was a protease inhibitor along with Truvada. Truvada contains what? TAF, tenofovir. Tenofovir. Now, tenofovir comes in 2 formulations, TDF and TAF. TDF was the original. TDF is actually on the list of medications, HIV medications, that can cause mitochondrial toxicity. So they did this study on these 2, and they concluded that the protease inhibitor with Combivir was far more toxic and caused mitochondrial toxicity and gastrointestinal issues, and led to people discontinuing the treatment more so than the protease inhibitor and Truvada. But both were considered to be toxic for the same reasons. And that study was done in 28 days. So in 28 days, the medication that I was on was shown to be so toxic to the mitochondrial and gastrointestinal systems that it caused people to discontinue it. And I was on that medication for 5,000 plus days. So now that's a study that came out of the University of Barcelona through their HIV division. It was published in March of last year, and it's available on the internet. and there it is. I mean, again, there's real information which says this stuff happens. Now, Combivir isn't used that much anymore. It's kind of a last resort drug in HIV medications. There are so many more that are far more effective. But some medications like tenofovir TDF formulation can still cause it to some degree. But more and more research is coming out on it, because there's still a lot of cancer drugs that cause very similar things. They attack the body in very similar manners. So that's why some of the research is being done. I even contacted the Department of Oncology at the University of Alberta and asked if there was anybody that was a specialist that I could be in touch with, and didn't hear anything back from them. So obviously there's no specialist there either.
We've heard a lot over the last number of years that HIV is manageable. It's like diabetes. You pop your pill, and as long as you're on top of it, you're going to be fine. That's what's been said here for the last number of years. But listening to you here today, I hear the peaks and the valleys, and oh my gosh, there's a lot going on. Would you would you agree with that statement about how it's manageable and that we're not to worry about HIV anymore?
No, I wouldn't disagree with it. You got to remember, I'm a long hauler. Okay, it's been almost 25 years for me, and I was there in some of the early years still. The HIV medications that are out there now are considerably less toxic. Most of them that are used now are easy to take. It's one pill a day. They have very little, effect on the body. They don't cause, any symptoms like diarrhea or anything like that for most people. So yes, it is very manageable now. This is a story of me. This is a story that goes back 25 years. This is a story of someone who was left on a medication for a very long period of time, much longer than I should have been. And I understand the reasons why my doctor left me on it. It was because I had become resistant to so many other drugs. And she literally told me that when she put me back on the medication, she said, "We're going to leave you on this until it doesn't work any longer." So, you know, I was on it for a very long period of time. Most people that were on that kind of medication are dead. So, they don't have stories like mine because they've already died because of the product of the after effects of medications like Convair. I mean, it took their toll, so they can't research on them. They don't have preventative measures to put in place to help sustain life after you've been on these medications because they're all dead. I'm an anomaly. I'm a unique individual that has managed to survive something, and so it's kind of odd. But I know that there are other people out there that have been around a very long time that were on some of the medications that may be having some similar issues, but their doctors aren't telling them about it because they don't know about it. So that's what I'm hoping that this podcast helps get some word out there that yes, there is help for people who are long haulers like me. There is ways of restoring your health if it's dying. There is hope for you, but you have to battle your doctor. And if some of the information I've given today helps you, by all means. I mean, there are just without the human growth hormone, the basic therapies, including the testosterone, which you generally can get from your doctors, and the supplements. Those in particular, the supplements in particular, like the L-carnitine, creatine, and multivitamins, those can make a huge difference for somebody. And there's even one of the big telltale signs of people with AIDS was always their sunken in cheeks and hollow faces. There's hope there too. My father passed away a number of years ago, and had a little bit of money was sent my way from his estate, and so I went and spent it on my face. And there's a product called Sculptra, which they inject into the skin to fill out the hollows, and was actually trialed in San Francisco in the 90s on HIV patients, specifically for people experiencing the HIV wasting. So it was a couple $1,000s, but even symptoms, visual symptoms like the sunken cheeks, can be rectified. So there's a lot of hope out there. What I've gone through, if anything, proves that you don't have to succumb to the bad effects from the HIV treatments. That there is something that can counteract those.
So if a healthcare professional is listening to our conversation today, what would you like for him or her or they to take away from this? What is the key point that you want them to listen to?
The biggest thing that any doctor can do is first of all listen to the patient, and if they're bringing in information that they think might help in their care, be open to it. Be open to consider it, and spend more than the 10 minutes that you spend in that examination room. I mean, we all know the doctor comes in, 10 minutes later, he goes out the door, and that's the last he thinks about you. I mean, literally, 95% of doctors do that, I'm sure. So pushing doctors to think to go beyond that 10-minute interval that you're in the examination room, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. And there are so few of them out there. We need more doctors that are going to go beyond that 10 minutes, go beyond that examination room door, to be open to other things, to sit down with Google and Google stuff. I mean, there is a lot. I mean, there's a lot of research on the internet, which is coming from reputable sites. I mean, I could literally find, studies and research done by local doctors here in Edmonton, like Dr. Senior, who did islet transplant research and actually pioneered islet transplant for diabetics. Um, that research is on the internet. So if I went in, pulled it off the internet and went into a diabetic doctor and said, this is what this says about islet transplants. If he turns his nose up, he's turning his nose up to this guy at the University of Alberta Hospital. I mean, not all internet research is bad. Yeah, there's some bad stuff out there, but there's also some really good research on the internet, and not everything that's in your doctor books not everything that you're going to come across is in your doctor books. I mean, those were written 10 years, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And even what you learn in your residencies, you may not come across things like this, or you may come across it once and one doctor handles it this way, and that's all you ever learn about it. You have to be open to possibilities. As a health professional, they should be open to going outside the box, and they should be open to, sitting down and doing some actual Googling. It doesn't hurt to Google.
So today it's 2021. What would you say to the younger Ron Byers, who was diagnosed back in 1998? What would you say to him today if you were able to have that type of conversation?
I'm not sure I would change how I did life or what I did in my life. I'm not sure how I could have handled things differently. I mean, sure, I guess when it comes down to it, I wasn't using a condom at some points, obviously, and maybe I could have been more cautious and careful in ensuring I had safer sex. But at the same time, you have to balance that with do you live your life or not? And at the time, that was I felt it was probably better to live life. I thought, I'm gay, I can't marry, I can't, it's barely legal. Yeah, it was. I'm not sure I would change how I live my life. I'm quite happy with my life in general. I've had a good time. It's been a challenge the last 10 years, but it hasn't been so bad.
You talked a lot about living for tomorrow, living day by day, and now you've got some hope. You're feeling much better and you're becoming more active within the community and just everyday life. So, other than looking at what you're going to do tomorrow, which is Monday, uh, what are your plans for the next year, the next 5 years?
I still have no concept of planning for 5 years in the future. That still does not exist within me yet. I still live day by day. Uh, but at least now I'm sitting down and thinking, okay, maybe there are some things that I can do to leave some impact. And doing the stories for the Edmonton City Museum Project website this past year was part of that. Um, I've sat down and developed the Edmonton Queer History Story Portal as a launch point for people, telling stories of our queer history here in Edmonton. That kind of got pushed off to the side during the pandemic, but I'm going to sit down with my partner on that, Rob Roatsky, and get that back into gear again. And we've got some interesting people that we're going to bring in as part of our sort of community advisory team and see how that goes, and look towards finding funding for it as well. So that's one of the projects that right now I'm working on as well.
Yeah, and it's definitely amazing, and that's what brought me to you was through your stories, and we're going to have you come back for sure on future episodes of Tales of the LGBTQ plus, because you are a historian, you are a witness, you are a storyteller, and after our conversation today, we can definitely add the word advocate to you as well. Ron, thank you for this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I know I'm going to have to Google a lot of this information that you've given to us today. You've definitely opened up my eyes to this situation even more so than before. So thank you for that. Let's make sure that we tell everybody once again where we can find the written work that you've been doing recently. Can you tell us where we can find that?
Sure. This summer, we published a series of five stories on the history of gay bars in Edmonton. That's available on the Edmonton City as Museum Project, or ECAMP. It's run by the Edmonton Historical Council. And if anybody has any questions on some of the stuff that you and I have talked about here today, they can get in touch with me either on social media or they can go to my website, ronbyers.com, and there's a link there that they can get in touch with me personally. And I'm happy to discuss anything that I've talked about. A number of friends have reached out to me privately over the last year or so and to see what I've done, and I'm happy to share that. I was happy to share that information, and I'm happy to share it with anybody else. I'm pretty frank in my discussions. So if anybody wants to learn more about this or where I'm getting my information, by all means, reach out to me.
That's fantastic. Thank you once again for this conversation. And as you know, we're going to be talking a lot more to you. So, on behalf of myself and the podcast Tales of the LGBTQ, I want to thank everyone for listening to this important conversation today. Please remember to be good, and also please text when you get home. Until next time.